When 19-year-old Sarah broke down crying during Elvis's final song at his last concert ever, something happened that stopped 19,000 people dead in their tracks. The king of rock and roll did something so unexpected and tender that it transformed his final performance into the most heartbreaking moment in music history. But what did Elvis whisper to that young girl that made grown men weep and created a legend that still gives people chills 47 years later? It was a June evening of 1977. The summer heat pressed down on Indianapolis like a heavy blanket, but inside Market Square Arena, 19,000 souls had gathered for something they didn't yet know would be historic. June 26, 1977. The air conditioning struggled against the massive bodies. The anticipation, the electricity that seemed to crackle between the rafters and the floor, where Sarah Martinez stood pressed against the barrier, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal rail. She'd worked double shifts at the diner for 3 months to afford this ticket. 19 years old, wearing her best dress. The blue one, her mother said, brought out her eyes, with Elvis pins carefully arranged on her collar like badges of devotion. Around her, fans of every age swayed in the pre-show energy, but Sarah stood perfectly still, afraid that if she moved, if she breathed too hard, this moment might dissolve like a dream. The lights dimmed. A collective intake of breath swept through the arena like wind through wheat. Then, the opening chords of C.C. Rider thundered through the speakers, and there he was. Elvis Aaron Presley stepped into the spotlight, sequin jumpsuit catching the stage lights like scattered stars. But something was different tonight. Sarah had studied every photograph, every television appearance, every bootleg recording she could find, and she could see it immediately: the way his shoulders carried more weight than just the costume, the way his smile seemed to require effort. He moved to center stage with that familiar swagger, but his breathing was labored between songs. When he spoke to the crowd, his voice carried a gravitas that hadn't been there in the earlier concerts she'd watched on TV. "Good evening, Indianapolis," he said. And even from her spot in the front row, Sarah could see something vulnerable flickering behind those famous eyes. The king was still magnificent, still commanding, but tonight felt like he was giving them pieces of himself he'd never shared before. As he launched into Jailhouse Rock, his movements sharp and powerful despite everything, Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Not tears of joy, though joy was there, but something deeper. Something that whispered this was precious, because it was finite. The other fans screamed and cheered, caught up in the spectacle, but Sarah watched the man beneath the legend, and what she saw both thrilled and broke her heart. This wasn't just a concert. This was a farewell, even if nobody else knew it yet. Behind the glittering facade and the thunderous applause, Elvis carried the accumulated weight of 2 decades at the pinnacle of fame. His body, once a perfect instrument of rhythm and rebellion, now betrayed him with each labored breath, each careful movement across the stage. The prescription bottles in his dressing room told a story of a man trying to hold himself together with chemistry and willpower, fighting battles the audience would never see. But tonight, something drove him beyond the pain, beyond the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Perhaps it was the faces in the crowd, faces like Sarah's, lit with pure devotion and hope. Perhaps it was the knowledge, somewhere deep in his soul, that moments like these were numbered. Whatever the source, Elvis poured himself into each song with an intensity that surprised even his longtime musicians, who had watched him struggle through recent performances. When he reached for the high notes in "It's Now or Never," his voice cracked slightly, but instead of hiding the imperfection, he leaned into it, letting the audience hear the humanity beneath the polish. Sarah watched him wipe sweat from his brow between songs, saw how he steadied himself against the piano during a brief instrumental break, and felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the invincible king from her bedroom posters. This was a man giving everything he had left, knowing it might not be enough, but giving it anyway. The arena pulsed with energy, But Elvis seemed to be drawing from something deeper than the crowd's enthusiasm. He was pulling from memory, from love, from the part of him that had always been more interested in touching hearts than breaking records. Between Love Me Tender and Hound Dog, he paused longer than usual, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, as if trying to memorize each one. Sarah felt his gaze pass over her section, and for a moment that lasted forever and no time at all, their eyes met. In that instant, she understood what she was witnessing wasn't just entertainment, it was communion. A man saying goodbye to the thing that had defined his life, to the people who had made him who he was, to a version of himself that was slipping away with each passing day. The setlist moved toward its inevitable conclusion, and Sarah could feel the evening gathering itself towards something momentous. When Elvis stepped to the microphone for what everyone knew would be his closing song, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath. The opening notes of Can't Help Falling in Love floated through the arena like a prayer made audible. Elvis stood center stage, one hand resting gently on the microphone stand, the other hanging loose at his side as if he'd finally allowed himself to relax into this moment. The song had become his signature farewell, the tender goodbye that audiences across the country had come to expect. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like truth. "Wise men say," Elvis began, his voice softer than it had been all evening, "only fools rush in." The melody wrapped around the arena like silk, and Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. She had heard this song countless times on her record player at home, had sung along until she knew every inflection, every breath. But hearing it now, seeing the way Elvis closed his eyes as he sang, understanding that this might be the last time, it was too much. The tears came without warning, hot and unstoppable, streaming down her cheeks as she pressed both hands to her mouth. This wasn't the crying of teenage hysteria or fan worship. This was grief, pure and simple. The kind that comes when you realize something beautiful is ending and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Around her, other fans swayed and sang along, but Sarah stood frozen in her sorrow, her whole body shaking with the weight of what she was losing. "But I can't help falling in love with you," Elvis continued. And then, something extraordinary happened. His voice faltered, not from fatigue or illness, but because he had noticed her. From 40 feet away, across the sea of faces and the glare of stage lights, Elvis Presley saw Sarah Martinez crying in the front row, and the sight of her tears stopped him mid-verse. The music continued for a few more beats. The band hadn't realized what was happening, but Elvis had stepped back from the microphone, his hand still gripping the stand, but his attention completely focused on the young woman in the blue dress, who was crying as if her heart was breaking. The arena, all 19,000 people, began to sense that something had shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the most exuberant fans turned to see what had captured their idol's attention. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of collective breath held, of time suspended between one moment and the next. Elvis remained motionless, studying Sarah's face with an expression that was equal parts concern and understanding, as if he recognized something of himself in her tears. The stage lights caught the moisture in his own eyes, and those close enough to see realized that the king was crying too. What happened next would be remembered and retold for decades, passed down like folklore, but for those who witnessed it, the moment felt as natural and inevitable as sunrise. Elvis stepped away from the microphone with deliberate grace, his movements no longer those of a performer, but of a man responding to another human being in pain. He walked to the edge of the stage, his sequin jumpsuit catching the light with each step, until he stood directly above where Sarah pressed against the barrier. The arena watched in absolute silence as Elvis reached up and slowly, reverently, removed the silk scarf from around his neck, the same scarf that had absorbed his sweat and emotion throughout the evening, the same scarf that had become as much a part of his image as his voice itself. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking down at Sarah with eyes that held 20 years of understanding about what it meant to love something so much it hurt. "Don't cry, darling," he whispered, though his voice carried in the hushed arena far enough for hundreds to hear. "Save those tears for something worth crying about." With infinite gentleness, he leaned down and placed the scarf directly into Sarah's trembling hands, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant, a touch that was both blessing and farewell. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's sobs transformed into something between laughter and wonder, her tears now flowing from gratitude rather than grief. But it wasn't just Sarah who was affected. The gesture rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Around her, hardened security guards wiped their eyes. Behind her, a middle-aged man in a business suit openly wept. Across the arena, 19 people who had come to see the king discovered they had witnessed something far more precious. They had seen Elvis the man choosing compassion over performance, connection over spectacle. Elvis returned to the microphone and finished the song, but his voice now carried a tenderness that transformed the familiar lyrics into something sacred. When he sang, "Take my hand, take my whole life too," he wasn't just performing. He was offering a piece of his soul to everyone in that room. The final notes hung in the air long after he'd left the stage, and even the thunderous standing ovation felt reverent rather than celebratory. In the years that followed, as the world mourned the loss of Elvis Presley just weeks later, Sarah's story would be told and retold, becoming legend. But for those who were there that night, no retelling could capture the real magic, the moment when the king of rock and roll chose to be simply human, and in doing so, became immortal.